today, I'm going to kind of open up a window on the research that I do, which considers how technological systems, things like buildings and infrastructures, maintain structural racism in US cities. I also do things like examine how people bring those systems into question, how they rework them to build the grounds for liberation and for repair. And the talk itself scrunches together some arguments that I'm thinking through across a number of different writing projects. So I'm really looking forward to your comments and to your questions and to the discussion that we're going to have. The talk itself is about 45 minutes. If you've been to a talk by historians or anthropologists, you know that we love stories, so there's a lot of stories. But please interrupt at any time. And I want to start here just by acknowledging how here on our campus of the University of Massachusetts, we occupy the stolen homelands of the Nurwaduk community of the Pecumtuck Nation. And under the Morrill Land Grant Act, lands from 82 indigenous nations west of the Mississippi were stolen and sold to provide the financial basis for our university. And despite 400 years of settler colonization, indigenous peoples continue to make active lives in this region and in those regions west of the Mississippi. And acknowledging stolen land is good, but action is better, I think. And so I have an ask to non-indigenous people in our audience, myself included, and that is for us to act to be in better relations with the lands that we occupy and their peoples. And one way of doing that is by amplifying the work of the Okoto Center in Ashfield and the Josephine White Eagle Cultural Center on our campus. These are indigenous-led organizations that are supporting the survivance of indigenous peoples and communities in our region. And for non-indigenous folks who are able, I'd ask you to support them financially. I've given you QR codes if you want to follow that. And for several reasons, I think, this land acknowledgement is an appropriate place to start this talk, because it distills how complicity in settler colonial formations of white supremacy isn't a simple matter of what's in our heads or even the actions that we take as individuals. Complicity in the structural violence of indigenous possession is something that is made through institutions and environments. And acknowledging these complicities, uneven as they are, is only really a start, because repairing cumulative racist violence takes more than words. It takes different formulations of work, of resources, and of struggle. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'll begin by just talking a little bit about where my research sits theoretically and methodologically. And then for most of the time, we'll get some stories. I'll draw from my ethnographic and historical data on vacant building demolitions in Detroit. We'll hear first from a multiracial contingent of Detroit residents and administrators, and they'll suggest that eliminating empty buildings from the landscape literally disposes of the accumulated detritus of white supremacy. And yet, as becomes clear to Detroiters who live closest to demolition sites, building removal doesn't make things go away. It transforms them into dust. And that dust is filled with lead, asbestos, and other hazardous materials. It settles into neighborhoods that are inhabited by predominantly Black and Latinx Detroiters. But dusts also sediment into soil. And we'll focus on the ways that Black and brown Detroiters leverage contaminated grounds to disrupt the plans of speculative owners. And by tracing this course from destruction through contamination into the dirt, I want to press at the tension here. On the one hand, there's this possibility that building demolitions can disrupt structural violence. And on the other, there's the reality that destruction compounds embodied geographies of anti-Black harm. And by pressing on that tension, I want to ask us to shift our thinking a little bit on what justice for environmental racism entails. And I hope we can think together from demolitions in Detroit toward proposals for reparations funds that are emerging on this continent. In a normative way, I want to argue that reparations for systemic violence of white supremacy in all of its guises must extend beyond the narrow bounds of political recognition and the redistribution of land and capital. Repair requires the strategic redistribution of landscapes themselves, not just in meaning or ownership, but in the physical stuff of toxins, of soils, and of atmosphere. So that's the plan. Because for several years now, I've been trying to understand the causes, procedures, and consequences of empty building removals in Detroit. And demos are routine events in this city. Since 2014 or so, some 22,000 empty buildings have been torn down within the city limits. And if we broaden out the time scale a few decades, say 1950, more than 250,000 buildings have been demolished without replacement there. And that's approximately 1/2 of the structures ever built in Detroit. And in many ways, Detroit's landscape is the place on this continent that urban planners think from to understand the effects of systemic population contraction. Around 575,000 folks live in Detroit right now, and that's down from 1.8 million people who lived there in 1950. So as planners like Margie Dewar, June Manning Thomas, and Brent Ryan argue, decline in this way isn't merely the absence of growth. It produces its own unique sets of spatial contexts. And I've been thinking recently with geographer Jason Hackworth's work, because in it he argues that the spatial forms of what we call decline and abandonment aren't just produced by kind of haphazard economic systems. They are the direct result of anti-black racism and fiscal conservatism. And my own work builds from this to understand how unequal socioeconomic conditions drive the production of space, as well as how those conditions might be configured otherwise. At the same time, my research shifts our optic on spatial racism and possibilities for repair toward a more human scale. I am an anthropologist afterward. And in doing so, I try to work across studies of racial capitalism into those of what is called urban political ecology. And that is to say, my work is grounded in an analytic of racial capital. That means I consider how racial hierarchies aren't just some byproduct of capital accumulation. Rather, I approach how racism is the foundation upon which our contemporary political economic systems are predicated. My work also centers an approach of urban political ecology. That is, I'm interested in the ways that environmental conditions in cities are shaped by socio-political and economic processes. Because when we turn to environmental conditions in places like Detroit, they really force us to reckon with how inequity is an environmental force. Toxicities accrete in bodies and landscapes, and they do so in ways that produce and reproduce the race, class, and gendered conditions in which people live. Now, as my work brings racial capital and political ecology together in cities, it allows us, I think, to gain a different kind of vantage on the ways that structural inequities operate, especially on how things like environmental racism operate. And it's from this vantage, I think, that we can see how structural inequities aren't simply reproduced due to institutional or ideological forces. Rather, privilege and oppression are environmentally and infrastructurally made. They're physical conditions that are embodied and emplaced. And likewise, approaching structural racism in this way shifts our focus on repair a little bit. It lets us think differently about how people struggle to build alternatives from the wreckage of unequal systems. And today we'll see how people don't just seek to tear down white supremacy, they also work to build up means of repairing the enduring, all too material, and often toxic environments of anti-blackness. And if this were a talk for anthropologists or historians, this is the point where I jump right into some stories drawn from my fieldwork. But something that I was super excited to give this talk, because talking to people outside of this narrow disciplinary box really forced me to slow down and tell you how it is that I know what I know. Because methodologically, I've approached the process of removing empty buildings through 60 months of fieldwork spread between 2010 and 2020. In practical terms, I watched around 400 and some odd demolitions, often in the company of people who live near them. I trained as an excavator operator and as an asbestos abatement specialist. I observed more than 100 public meetings where Detroiters, municipal employees, NGO administrators, planned out demolitions. They got into disputes about them. And I spoke in depth with 402 people who relate to building demolitions, either as neighbors, as administrators, as workers, as researchers, as regulators. And to contextualize what I saw, I analyzed municipal and regulatory archives. But through it all, the demolition site remained a kind of central node that hinged together landscapes of people, of machines, of documents, and of capital. And I'm happy to speak in immense detail, much greater detail about my kind of methodological strategy here. But I hope as we get into my empirics, you'll hear my interlocutors on their own terms. And we'll start here with destruction. We can begin at a press conference organized by the public-private partnership that manages building removals in the city of Detroit. The structure was to celebrate its 10,000th demolition, or the gathering was to celebrate its 10,000th demolition, and the structure was a brown and white craftsman-style house. It had been vacant for a decade, and it was marked up for the occasion. And if you can see, it says 10,000. And the celebration touched off with an invocation from the pastor of a nearby AME church. He took to the microphone and proclaimed, quote, "We thank you, God, for the women and men who take the lead in removing this blight, this structural refuse from our city. God, we take this time to pray peace into the world. For, Lord God, what is being done here is peace-giving work," end quote. And when the invocation ended, demolition workers climbed up into excavators and they reduced the building to rubble. Now, despite the spectacle surrounding this particular event, building removals are super routine occurrences in Detroit. So when it comes to proceedings like this, we might wonder how, and especially for whom, processes which involve an excavator eating into a building are experienced as a kind of peace-giving work. Because the sort of demolitions that I'll talk about today are distinct from the kinds of removals that typify accounts of uneven urban development. Because if you know the stories of Boston's West End, of New York Central Park, so many other places on this planet, you know cases in point for how demos have been used as a strategy, one that displaces racially and economically oppressed people to build new things for the economically and racially privileged. By contrast, building removals like those I've observed in Detroit for years now, the only thing that comes after are grass-covered lots. And this is what the ideal end result of demolition is supposed to look like in Detroit. So to consider how and why it is that is inhabited as a kind of peace-giving work, I want to focus on a single building, this one here. It was a retail complex that stood until a few years ago on Detroit's east side. And the histories that we can pull out of it are illustrative of ones that have produced tens of thousands of empty buildings across Detroit. Because if we stick with this building, there wasn't a press conference on the day I watched it be torn down. But I was joined by two black women who I call Maureen and Ellen. They're identical twins. They were in their 60s when I talked to them. And they'd lived in the neighborhood since the mid-70s. And Maureen and Ellen and I watched together over the next several hours. We watched as jumbles of brick and wood and plaster and other components were loaded into mobile dumpsters like this one, bound for area landfills. And as we watched, Maureen and Ellen reflected on what this building had been. From their recollections and county records, I can tell you that this structure was built in 1943 for a person, probably a man, identified as C.H. Brown. It was a hardware and grocery store. It would have catered to an almost entirely white neighborhood. Many who shopped at the businesses did so with wages they earned on nearby assembly lines. And in the decades after World War II, racially restrictive housing covenants that maintained all white neighborhoods in places like Detroit began to unravel. Black families joined white neighbors at hardware and grocery counters. And in the late 50s, the owners of these shops uprooted them. Like white residents, they decamped outside of city limits. Their new addresses were in all-white districts, districts that would remain that way until the turn of the 21st century. From the late 60s through the 80s, this was a store that specialized in kids' clothes. Around 84, it was replaced by a shoe store. In 92, the shoe store was evicted. A phone company sales branch moved in, but it only made it a couple of years, and it closed in the early 2000s as part of a company-wide restructuring. Now, despite the changing uses of this building, the family of C.H. Brown profited from it over decades. They collected rent checks from this building and hundreds of others. The real estate trust that held them was collateral for the construction of waterfront mansions. But after that phone sales outlet closed, the trust stopped making tax payments for the structure. The building was seized by the county treasurer. It entered what is referred to as the Demolition Pipeline. And Maureen and Ellen recalled how, in the absence of human occupants, raccoons took up residence. People who lived closer talked about putrid odors emanating from the site. And I've written about how fires and odors and other sensory effects of empty buildings are an environmental justice concern. They're harms that are concentrated in majority black neighborhoods. Here, though, I want to draw us to a specific exchange that Maureen and Ellen had during that demolition, because in it they situate empty buildings within historical shifts of regional population. Maureen began it, quote, "We have all of these buildings, not just this one, because people didn't take them with them as they turned out the lights," end quote. And Ellen picked up the thread here, quote, "Yeah, when we moved here, this was an integrated neighborhood. Now you see it's all black folks. The white folks took our money and left, but didn't take their buildings," end quote. And Maureen continued, quote, "And we need the demolitions to clean up their mess, to move forward as a city," end quote. In this exchange, Maureen and Ellen don't just offer a means of reading one particular building, this one here. They offer us a way of reading empty buildings in general. They gesture to places like this, but also this, and thousands like these. Maureen and Ellen point us to how people encounter empty buildings as the material products of racism and capital accumulation on a grand scale. Because with profits in hand, the Brown family and others might have pulled up stakes from Detroit, but they're not gone. Their presence lingers on. They're in the raccoon infestations. They're in the noxious smells, and they're in the fires. Buildings like these orient us to how the evacuation of people, of industry, and wealth from places like Detroit builds up geographies elsewhere. And for decades, Detroit has been among the most segregated metropolitan region in the United States. And it's structures like this that made that happen. So with that in mind, I want us to linger on Maureen's statement. We need the demolitions to clean up their mess, to move forward as a city. Because like the pastor who identified building removals as peace-giving work, Maureen positions clearing away the detritus of racist disinvestment as integral to collective healing. And the possibilities of this kind of reparative shift didn't just animate the hopes of Detroit residents on the sidelines of demolition. They're a potent political force. Since 2014, some $500 million in public funds have been directed into building removals in Detroit. And there are plans in place to spend $500 million more by 2025. And that's $1 billion in a city where the schools have been in receivership, where nearly 40% of folks live in poverty, and where public health services are practically non-existent. And at a conference for demolition specialists, a demo administrator from Detroit offered a justification for these funding priorities. And he did so using a series of before and after demolition photos like these ones here. He explained, quote, "Demos clear away the actual structure made because of racism and economic inequality. You can't do that with Band-Aids. Demos remove structures to give people a fresh start," end quote. So for onlookers like Maureen and Ellen, as much as for administrators like this one, leveling empty buildings is experienced as uprooting the structural forces of disinvestment and white flight. And we can think of Marx actually, maybe here, right? Specifically his good old chestnut, that how all that is solid can melt into air. Because in the move from this to this to this, the structure very much looks to have disappeared. The transformation of a decaying building into a patch of grass looks to be a fresh start, a move toward equity in the wake of racial capitalist destruction. But in the next few minutes, I want to show us how demolitions don't just melt buildings figuratively into air. They do so literally. And we can follow this through contamination. Because if you watch demolition sites closely enough, you'll catch particulate rising with each swing of the excavator bucket. And it doesn't usually photograph well, but here's a clip of what I'm talking about. So if you're able, I want you to watch for the gray haze. Because that haze occurs even with the kind of best practices for environmentally safe demolitions. Because despite best practices, crushing buildings with heavy machinery inevitably sends their components airborne. And we can understand the stakes of this particulate by visiting this demolition site on Detroit's far west side. It's one where a crew was tearing through the remains of an auto repair shop. The demo occurred on a morning in early summer. Kids were playing in the yard surrounding the demo site, and adults looked on from front porches. I watched from the front porch of a woman that I call Eunice. She was in her 50s at the time, and her 10-year-old granddaughter Grace was playing in the yard. As Grace played, the excavator knocked loose a support beam, and a gush of soot came angling across the street. Eunice stood and motioned Grace into the house. As Eunice bundled her through the door, the little one asked, quote, "Granny, why are they setting that house on fire?" End quote. And her grandmother responded, quote, "It's not fire, but something like it. That's why they've got the water to keep us safe," end quote. And a month or so later, I received a frantic call from Eunice. During tests at a routine physical, a physician had found lead in Grace's blood. And Grace was one of tens of thousands of kids in Detroit whose blood tested positive for lead that year. In 2016, around 8.8% of kids in Detroit were lead poisoned, and in some zip codes, the rate was as high as 22%. For a little bit of context, it was about 4.9% of kids in Flint who were lead poisoned during that city's water crisis. And like in Flint, those affected in Detroit were most likely to be black. So it was in the wake of this statistical bombshell that Detroit's health department issued a report that statistically linked the rise in childhood lead poisoning cases to the uptick in demolitions. And as they wrote, tearing through lead-painted surfaces, walls, ceilings, doors, moldings, etc., unleashes lead particles. Those particles enter lungs, and then they enter blood. And it has been water crises in Flint and Newark and other cities that have thrust lead back into the American popular consciousness. Because consuming lead is linked to all manner of physical health problems, tremors, kidney failure, developmental difficulties. So for these reasons, lead has become a very real matter of concern on demolition sites. But building removals also dredge up other harmful materials. For instance, nearly all buildings demolished in Detroit have asbestos-containing components in them somewhere. These materials can include siding, plaster, drywall, cement, shingles, basically anything. And asbestos fibers are shaped like microscopic knives. Breathing them in, especially a lot of them, especially over time, is linked to respiratory problems, plaques, cancers. And most asbestos is removed prior to knockdown, but hidden runs of things like fireproof insulation really only surface. You only know that they're there when you run the building through with an excavator. And when this happens, dust clouds can be cancerous. PCBs, arsenic, mercury, they're less common in residential buildings, though they do exist. But demolitions of industrial and commercial facilities disturb them with regularity. Increasing concentrations of them in the body correlate to hormonal changes, to illness, to premature death. And it might be common sense to think that hazardous materials should be removed from our immediate environments, that they should be expelled no matter the cost. But stuff like asbestos insulations, certain leaded fixtures, are actually less harmful when we leave them in place. Perhaps not in this building, but in the one where I work, in Mackmur, you can find a lot of latent toxicities in the wall. You poke around, you find signs like this. They say, hazards in place, don't touch, don't disturb. But demolitions, they unsettle these configurations, and they bring new sorts of contamination into being. They produce things like lead in the air. And in the case of Grace and others, that lead in the air enables lead in the blood. And particulate clouds like the one that probably brought lead into Grace's body are common. I could tell you story after story after story that features them. Because in straightforward terms, the dust kicked up by building demolitions allow us to trouble the idea that demolishing buildings like this one here clears away racist environments. Rather, within the motion of the excavator, we can see how the remains of white flight and deindustrialization are transformed into different possibilities for harm. And that's partly because demolition dust doesn't travel very far. Hazardous particles, especially lead, tend to fall within 500 meters of building removal sites. And here's a map of what that fallout looks like for 1 year. The pattern of contamination settles within the same majority Black and Latinx neighborhoods that contend with the existence of empty buildings to begin with. And for years, environmental health activists have seized on maps like this one to advocate for different demolition protocols, for ones that would release less dust. And for years, demo authorities have declined. They've declined because in most cases, there are no environmental regulations on demolitions in the United States. Releasing dust from demolition sites is entirely legal. It's legal even if that dust might be loaded with lead or mercury or PCBs. And the refusal to contain demolition dust here is a textbook instance of environmental racism. In the US, we know that Black and brown communities bear disproportionate burdens of contamination. And Bob Bullard and Beverly Wright helpfully summarize how non-white Americans have what they call the wrong complexion for protection. And that turn of phrase really captures how environmental contamination in majority white communities produces new efforts to contain and regulate hazards. But when similar events befall non-white communities, it usually generates only hand-wringing and moral outrage. Yet, I think demolitions do more than confirm our knowledge of uneven patterns of regulatory care and neglect. We've seen how empty buildings materialize processes that maintained all white communities. Demolitions reconfigure the stuff of that disinvestment. They turn it into airborne hazards. So dust clouds like this one are an inflection point. They're an inflection point between historical and emergent conditions of inequity. And at the beginning of this talk, we heard how demolition was peace-giving work, an essential step for moving forward in the wake of structural violence. And yet, dust clouds like this one mark how moving forward isn't a zero-sum game. There are costs to cleaning up after racist disinvestment. And these are costs that are directed squarely into the bodies of already marginalized people. So, from the lead in Grace's bloodstream, we can see how conditions of racial capitalism don't merely shape who gets to own what, who gets to live where. We carry these conditions in our physical beings. And I take places like the dusty margins of demolition sites as opportunities to grapple with how the relatively clean air that some of us might take for granted exists in relation to, and sometimes because of, contamination elsewhere. And it's by making these kinds of atmospheric connections, I think, that we can see how anti-blackness and white privilege accumulate. Not simply in bank accounts and property portfolios, we can find them by examining the very air that we breathe. So demolition emissions show us how racial privilege and oppression are maintained through structural transformations. But my aim isn't to leave us here as a puddle on the floor, to make us feel like there's no way to disengage from that kind of reproduction. So in the final section of the talk, I want to open up room for motion. I want to do so by considering what happens when hazardous air touches the ground, by following what can happen when dust sediments. We've seen how grass can make it look like peace has been given in the aftermath of disinvestment. Like one demo consultant was fond of telling me, quote, "Demos leave lots clean and green, Nick, clean and green." And this was something that was repeated to me over and over by lots of people. But these lots aren't clean. Like the dust that blew into Grace's lungs, they can be toxic. And the person who really helped clarify the dangers of toxic dirt to me is a man named Jay, who I call Jay. He's a black man who was in his late 20s and lived on Detroit's east side. Jay and his girlfriend Aubrey had their eyes on this lot here as the site for a vegetable garden. And they planned the garden using a guide that was published by the Ag Extension of a local university. The guide advised them to submit soil samples for lab testing to know if it was contaminated. And Jay rattled off to me how plants take on the characteristics of the soil in which they're grown, especially those that mature in or close to the ground. Carrots, onions, potatoes, all of which grow pretty well in Detroit. So Aubrey and Jay resolved to get a full battery of tests. One afternoon, Jay and I followed the lab sampling directions. We loaded dirt into bags. We shipped the samples to a lab. And there, technicians used a variety of reagents, microscopes, and other tests to elucidate the contents. A few weeks later, the lab emailed Jay a copy of their findings. The report said that a single-family home had been built on this site in around 1923. It was removed around 2005. It also said that the soil samples contained significant levels of lead, of arsenic, of asbestos, of mercury, of barium, and vinyl chloride. Now, Jay and Aubrey's lot wasn't unique. Folks have sampled dirt on former building sites across Detroit, and in thousands of cases, nearly all were contaminated in some way. More than 20% had lead levels high enough to be considered hazardous waste sites. So, simply put, it might appear as if a building has disappeared from this site, but the structure isn't really gone. It lingers on in toxins and toxicants that have been literally driven into the ground. And Jay and Aubrey knew this, but they didn't give up on their garden. They built raised beds like these ones. And the beds were just wooden frames lined with impervious fabric. So once filled with store-bought earth, they floated pockets of relatively clean soil atop the hazardous landscape compounded by demolition. And there's nothing super surprising here about Jay and Aubrey's strategy. In late industrial places like Detroit, raised beds are common. What surprised me, though, was how they printed out their soil testing report and filed it away in a shoebox. Got folded up with their social security cards. And the testing report became such an essential document because the pair didn't own the spot where they built their garden. The land was nominally owned by a limited license corporation linked to a prominent local developer. And this is a super common speculative move, because Detroit has literally hundreds of thousands of empty lots, and they tend to command relatively little on property markets. At the same time, those lots are snapped up by the dozens by firms and entities who hope that at some point in the future, they'll be worth a little bit more. And the same firm owned a number of lots in Jay and Aubrey's neighborhood. Documented landowners are known to demand $1 or $2 grand from folks like Jay and Aubrey who ask for permission to grow gardens in these sorts of places. So rather than buy into someone else's speculative trap, Jay and Aubrey hope to acquire their garden lot another way, through a legal maneuver called adverse possession. And they had a model for doing this. It was Aubrey's great-aunt Lenora. Lenora lived a few miles from Jay and Aubrey in a house like this one here, which she had inherited from her parents. As Lenora told it, they purchased it in 1932, one of the first Latinx families to move onto the block. And over the years, Lenora's neighbors had disappeared. The dwellings and small commercial strip around her had been torn down. And she found herself surrounded by grass that extended uninterrupted across 6 lots. but soil testing showed the underlying dirt was loaded with lead and barium, so her family spent a period of years incrementally tilling the yard. They covered it with new soil, new grass, and other plantings. They put a fence around it and produced a landscape like the one you see here. So here's a schematic of their spot. In most cases, Lenora had been able to formally purchase the parcels. She did this in '86, in '93, and in 2002. But there's a gap, right? A house was removed from that red lot in 1997, and the land remained in the control of a suburban investment firm. And the group didn't complain as Lenora decontaminated and maintained the lot without their permission. Like most absentee owners, they seemed entirely unconcerned about whether it even belonged to them. That changed when sales values began to rise in Lenora's neighborhood. And around 2015, one of the firm's partners tried to plant a for sale sign in the lot. He was prevented from doing so by Lenora's fence. So quickly after, Lenora was named in a civil lawsuit that alleged she was trespassing. It demanded she remove the fence and pay 20 grand in back rent. Lenora contested the suit, and in her court statement chronicled how she'd spent years caring for the lot. Her neighbors wrote affidavits stating that even though the land might nominally belong to the management group, it was Lenora's in practice, and it had been for some time. A judge in the local circuit court agreed. He transferred the property into Lenora's name as an adverse possession. And his ruling cited case law in adverse possession, and these cases drew on the routinized use of physical space to formalize things like easements for utilities, roadways, and subsurface mining. So Lenora here, she's not the only Detroiter I know who's claimed ownership of territory on the basis of care and use rather than capital, but I really have to admit that adverse possession cases like hers are super rare, because as in other cities, Detroit's wealthy, typically white developers mobilize the full weight of private property regimes, and they do so to exclude black and brown and poor folks from parts of the city that they've occupied for years. But Lenora's yard makes a couple things evident. It shows how dealing with the toxic dirt left by demolition opens up cracks in the very systems that might otherwise facilitate eviction. And these cracks are just wide enough that people can force different kinds of possibilities into alignment. And it was precisely these sorts of possibilities that Jay and Aubrey had in mind for this lot here. They documented their efforts to work within contaminated ground in hopes of gaining title to land. And like others seeking to effect adverse possessions, they understood their actions as justified. As justified precisely because they were subverting the aims of financial speculation. And yet, Jay also confessed a dissatisfaction with this prospect. We were filling the raised beds with soil when he mused, quote, "So what happens if we someday file a possession and get this spot? We get a bunch of toxic dirt." And he pointed to the ground, which we knew was filled with all kinds of stuff. And he continued, quote, "I'd really like to be able to take this dirt and give it to the people who made it, maybe trade it out with folks who live in Livonia or Birmingham, and those are predominantly white suburbs. Wouldn't that be some shit? Make it rain barium in the suburbs," end quote. And we both practically fell down laughing on the ground at that point. Because for people like Aubrey and Jay and Lenora, contending with the physical matter of toxic sites helps them invert the expected logics of uneven development. As we've seen, configuring lawns and gardens enables the physical and legal transfer of land away from absentee owners, and yet, by seizing grounds made by demolition, Jay notes they are gaining control of polluted places. Because grass might make sites like this appear clean and green, but if you dig a little deeper, you can encounter just how racial disparities become sedimented into place. So, over the course of this talk, building demolitions then have shown us how white supremacy and anti-blackness can be made durable. This happens even as their material structures are rendered into component parts. Demolitions in this way have allowed us to open up the overlapping material contents of structural inequity. And as we do, the aftermaths of demolition invite us to imagine and to theorize then the very sorts of environmental changes that might be necessary for building repair. And this invitation comes because demolitions demand that we take seriously how racism is physically made, preserved, and compounded through the environments of everyday life. And as we sit with demolition and its aftermaths, I think they can help us maybe think or work, hopefully, toward what it might take to end environmental racism. And I say that because our contemporary moment ripples with deliberate appeals to demolish white supremacy. And these are just two signs that I've seen. These are signs that call out to us to dismantle racism, to demolish white supremacy and capitalism and their interlocking inequities. And yet, if you take away one thing from this talk, I hope you take away that destruction on its own isn't a sure path to a clean slate. Because to be sure, for some people we've encountered, building removals are a meaningfully symbolic step forward. They offer a fresh start amidst the fallout of racism and disinvestment. And that's important. Yet, recall how interventions that some say are peace-giving work operate by putting toxins into the bodies and places of Black and brown Detroiters. So we've witnessed how tearing things down can recirculate rather than eliminate oppression and privilege. And approaching structural racism from this material vantage, I think, directs us to see how it's not just tearing down unequal systems, institutions, and landscapes. Folks like Jay and Aubrey and Lenora are actively working to build those things toward different ends. That is, they imagine and construct conditions of repair. And we've seen how caring for the toxic landscapes left by demolition allows people to seize land from speculative interests. Their redistributions of physical geography then echo ongoing intellectual and political debates about reparations. And here we might think about the rollout of what are called reparations funds in places like Evanston, New York, Detroit, Amherst. And these funds are means of redistributing housing and financial resources to African American people as a means of atoning for enslavement and its anti-Black afterlives. And that includes housing discrimination of the very sort that I've talked about today. I'm also thinking here with work from scholars like Catherine Frank and Olufemi Taiwo, because across various fields, political theory, law, design, philosophy, economics, activism, land is approached as a central technology for reparations. That's because changing who controls land can fill material voids. This is especially true when land is transferred from the structurally privileged to those who have borne the cost of that privilege. Consider buildings like this one. Though we could consider this one, or maybe even this one, but let's stick with this one here, because it has shown us the ways that white wealth has been made through intergenerational plunder. It materializes cases for reparations. But buildings like this also show us the need to expand the scope of repair. Think back to Jay and Aubrey's efforts to gain adverse possession. If successful, they will transfer property from a white-owned investment firm into the hands of a multiracial family. And that seems to be the very sort of repair that we should be celebrating. But that land is contaminated ground. It's polluted by barium, by asbestos, by vinyl chloride, and other substances that will never, ever decompose. They will literally last forever. So like the lead that was deposited in Grace's lungs and in her blood, the damage is ongoing. So put simply, land is a critical starting point when thinking about reparative conditions. But it's just that. It's a starting point. Because whether as a theoretical or as a political prospect, in order to understand how people seek repair for structural injustice, we have to seriously consider the multiple material dimensions of inequity. And that's land and capital, to be sure, but it's also toxicity. And here, I think demolition has something very meaningful to show us about reparations, about constructing conditions for repair. Put simply, I think it shows us how it's not enough to say yes to political recognition, to say yes to redistributing land, to say yes to redistributing housing, to say yes to rebalancing the scales to shift resources toward Black and brown and indigenous people and places. Those dimensions are vital, they're crucial, but they're not enough. To build repair, we also must ask what must be removed from people and places who have borne and continue to bear the brunt of environmental violence. That is, we need to say yes to redistributing contamination. We need to say yes to shifting toxic burdens away from places like Jay and Aubrey's garden, or maybe the incinerator in Agawam, or Superfund sites in Chelsea. Yes to moving those durable, never-gonna-go-away hazards toward those of us who have intentionally and not benefited and profited from their production. So in terms of, how we might think about making reparations for environmental racism, I wonder if it's possible to do more than shifting who controls the ground. To follow Jay's provocation, I wonder if we can imagine ways to fundamentally change what's in it. That is, of making it rain barium in the suburbs. Thanks for listening.